So what is actually happening is the first question to work out. And in this case, I'll also look backwards at what has actually happened historically. The second thing that we need to do is to understand why it's happened. And that might either be understand or explain, which are quite different intellectual activities. And the one that's the most interesting question is what we do to do better. And that's, I do want to pay some attention to that tonight, because Owen asked me to pay some attention to that. So the first point that I'd make is a simple one. We're living in very dark times. For the better part of the last 4 decades, we have seen a neoliberal makeover, engineered by successive governments since the Hawke-Keating governments began in March 1983. David Harvey succinctly sums up what a neoliberal makeover looks like. It's a political project that pretends to be something other than a political project. It's based on a theory of economic practice, that says human well-being can be best advanced if we hand everything over to a market-type process, in which we also then protect individual property rights or corporate property rights, free markets and ideas like free trade. None of this is actually what's going to happen, but that's the story that you're going to tell. The role of the state is then redefined to be an idea about creating and preserving a framework for these kinds of practices. Now, as Marcus Banks and his colleague Diana Bowman have pointed out, what we've seen actually happen in Australia is the use of state frameworks of policy, regulation, intervention, all the rest of it, to create a neoliberal social insecurity state. It's not a security state, it's an insecurity state where you render insecurity an endemic feature of large numbers of ordinary Australians' lives. And this is represented in various ways as educational policy, social policy, industry policy, blah, blah. What you get, and we've now seen, and it begins precisely under the Hawke-Keating government, is a combination of precarious employment, that is the return to precariousness, because that used to be the old norm until the 1940s. Something Guy Standing seems to have some trouble understanding. It's also about the creation of a system in which low and inconsistent wages becomes increasingly normative, in which you see, and I'll be paying most attention to this proposition, we see an increasingly conditional and punitive system of welfare payments, if you can call them welfare payments, accompanying relentless increases to the cost of living that end up making life emotionally, economically, financially insecure and stressful for many Australians, not just those at the bottom end of the income pile. It's no thing to be proud of that we now have the third largest proportion of part-time workers in the OECD, the big 32 capitalist countries, just behind Netherlands and Switzerland. About 40% of employment now in this country is non-standard. That is, it's no longer whatever it used to be when we had an effective, if flawed, industrial relations system. So that's the first big point, that's the context. And the current system, if you want to call it that, of social insecurity for people of working age, at 15 to 64 is my focus here. My main claim for tonight is simple. The current system of social insecurity is not working. As Owen has pointed out in various publications, for example, the average duration of unemployment benefits now is running in excess of 5 years. So we're not talking about short-term unemployment, we're talking about long-term endemic unemployment. We've also seen the punitiveness quotient increase dramatically, and it's a striking fact that you should take home and spread around whenever you meet people, that in 2017, in the second half, that is from June to December 2017, there are 827,000 recipients of UB, and there are 800,000 suspensions. We call ourselves a civilised society. It is just beyond belief. And this is not something that people understand or appreciate or acknowledge in this country. There's certainly no media about this in any way that you might expect to get. So this seems to me to amount to a consistent and major public scandal There are many other things to be said about the system of social insecurity that we've now got, but I wanted to put some of this into a political, historical context first, and then talk to what we might be doing to make things a bit better. So Owen asked me precisely to address the following three questions. What are the historic objectives of this old order of unemployment benefits in particular? Has this had any long-term effect? Because one thing you'll notice is that, like life itself, things don't change dramatically. Some things just keep on. There's an inertia, policy, people talk about path dependence. It just means stuff keeps sticking around for a long time, and I think we'll see evidence of that tonight. The second question I think he asked me to address is, how does the current system of unemployment benefits compare with previous systems? And again, I think we can say some simple things then. And the last one he asked me, which is the question of what do we do to make things better, I'm going to address in the last few minutes or last 10 minutes of the discussion. The short answer to the first question, what has the historic circumstance system, or whatever you want to call it, look like, is very simple. When Australia, as a white colonial space, was created, we brought into this space some long-standing ideas about the benefits of work and the criminal and deviant status of people who didn't work. They were called paupers. And the English, or British, mostly it's English history, was a long-term history which arcs back to the Elizabethan period in the late 15th, 16th century, when a system of poor law relief began to be constructed both locally and at the central level in London. That system creates a fundamental idea. There are people who are worthy and there are people who are not. Those who are not are to be punished. Those who are worthy will get something, provided they keep on being worthy, which is to say, socially obedient. From the origins then of whatever we're going to mean by our system of welfare, and most of it was run for much of the 19th century and well into the 20th century, we're talking about a network of charitable, philanthropic and church-based activities. Again, it's a matter of some record that the chief source of unemployment relief, for example, in a state or colony like Victoria, was a network of ladies' benevolent societies. There was one of those in every suburb, and they were what they sound like. They were committees run by ladies who would hand out, effectively, various kinds of food and clothing relief. They did not like to hand out money, and it is this system which headed straight into the crisis that began in the 1920s, not in 29, but probably in the mid-20s in places like Melbourne and Sydney, when rising unemployment began to manifest itself for the first time in a serious way in 4 or 5 decades. That system of ladies' benevolent societies was the primary response to mass unemployment. And those of you who know the history will know that in suburbs like South Melbourne, Collingwood, Richmond, Fitzroy, the unemployment rate was running at 90%. 90%. And the rates at which people were being evicted was running in the order of 500 to 600 in each week of houses in which police would move people on and out. My own parents remember being moved in Footscray, moving out I think once every 2 months, scrap together a bit of rental, move into the house and do the midnight flit the day before the guillotine dropped, and would then move to another place. That was what people did back then, in the day, as we might say. The moral economy, in short, of the distinction between the deserving and the undeserving was not accompanied by the institutional mechanisms which were created in Britain over the 200 to 300 years of what we'll call the Industrial Revolution. We did not create a poor law system. There was legislative enactments that required local governments, from the onset here in Victoria, for example, from the 1850s, to set up poor law mechanisms, but they never did it. They just refused. They wouldn't have a bar on it. So it was left to charity, church groups and so on to provide whatever was to become the unemployment relief that was to be available. And there's a detailed history to be written of how that worked out in practice. The exception to that story is the odd, and I'm not sure how you want to characterise Queensland. Queensland did in 1919 introduce a system of unemployment insurance. That made it a very odd state. It's remained an odd state. And of course, it worked somewhat in the 1920s, particularly in outback Queensland, to provide unemployed workers with some minimal system of relief. But because of the design problems with unemployment insurance, it was never going to be all that effective anyway. The second point to be made is that, and you can't emphasise this enough, Australia is an odd society when it comes to the provision of welfare. We are the one society on earth which decided not to set up an unemployment insurance system. We are exceptional. We are so exceptional as to, and the word unique here does actually mean what it means. We're the only society that's done it this way. That is to say, unemployment insurance is what it sounds like, it's a scheme in which workers contribute from their income, their wage income, to a fund, such that when they become unemployed, they can draw on that fund as of right. That was the scheme, the logic that was set up, first of all, under Bismarck in Germany in the 1880s. And it would be the model that would be adopted everywhere else around the world. Australia chose not to do that. And the reason for not doing that is, again, you can take a lot of time to explain why that didn't happen. What we set up, and it was set up initially in the context of the Second World War, was a scheme based on taxation. There was no expectation that employers would contribute to this, nor that the government would contribute to this. It was to be funded by general taxation that was imposed for the very first time in 1942 on all Australians. Now again, you need to remember that taxation was not something that most Australians paid until 1942. And it was in the context of a dramatic crisis that was occasioned by the eruption of war with Japan. And the bombing of Darwin concentrated mines wonderfully in Australia at that point. So the origins of what we would see as emerge as a scheme of national social security had their origins in a total war setting, a great deal of concern about how we would get through the war, the decision to create a taxation system, and to put it in as simple terms as one can, a scheme was created of unemployment benefits, sickness benefits, what we call sort of widows' benefits, and all the other sorts of benefits that become part of what we now would learn to call the Australian welfare state in the period 41, 42, 43, 44, was basically designed to make the imposition of taxes palatable. And I wrote a book about how that worked out in the 1980s. It was not done because of any flush of generosity or a sense of social justice. It was a crude economic project in which the key economists, most of them Keynesians, who were becoming part of the new dispensation in economic policy, decided that they needed to make the imposition of taxes palatable to people who had never been asked to pay them in the past. That is, working class people, with the impost of taxes reaching right down to the bottom income groups in this country. As you know, that coincided with a very important decision. The scarifying effects of the Great Depression were such that there was a general determination never to allow the impact of mass unemployment to occur again. So by 1944, again with the advice of key economists and international agreements that were emerging on the part of the Allies, the Australian government embraced a full commitment to full employment. It issued a white paper on full employment. America passed legislation to that effect in 1946. The British government, Canada, the New Zealanders would all formally embrace a commitment to full employment, in which the relevant nation state undertook to provide all of the economic policies that would secure full, and let's just put the word in brackets, male employment. And that would be the core accomplishment of the war period. And so when Reconstruction begins in 1945, we have Australian government formally committed, and it's a bipartisan commitment, so that even the Menzies Liberal Party, as it's newly created at that point, is committed to a project of policy, economic regulation, a whole raft of policies which would include interest rates set by the National Bank, the Reserve Bank, Commonwealth Bank. Immigration would be part of the story, investment in industry, a network of employment services would be created, the Commonwealth Employment Service, and all the rest of it was created with a view to securing the conditions of full employment as a real project for the post-war period. As we know, that project would last precisely almost 3 decades. It comes under attack in a number of different directions from both things happening in the economy but also from political, ideological changes around about 1975. And at that point, as we say, the story changes. The effect of full employment for much of the period from 45 to 75 was such as to render the problem of unemployment essentially non-existent. If you don't take into account women's experience and or Indigenous people in the far outback. But in broad terms, for the normal urban Australian, full employment, backed by the elaborate apparatus of industrial regulation, which included something called the basic wage, which is another idea. Remember that the basic wage was the idea that families had a right to a living wage. It was not one based on any determination of industry's capacity to pay. That little idea would be inserted into the conversation nationally whilst Bob Hawke was representing the ACTU in 1969. That would be the first nail in the coffin, if you like, of a certain conception of what a fair society should look like based on a mandated idea about living wages. So the 70s really become a kind of crucial turning point, and there's a whole series of elaborate discussions we had about how that happens, who's responsible, what role did the Whitlam Labor government have in this. Again, there's a fair bit of myth-making about Whitlam as a sort of the last of the great social democrats. That's essentially a bullshit story. He was responsible for the first great experiment in mass unemployment when he decided to impose tariff cuts at the advice of Alf Rettigan, the head of the Department of Trade, who was avant la lettre, before the ideology becomes a formal policy commitment, a neoliberal. So we do see the changes beginning in the mid-70s under Whitlam, and then there's a period of chaos under Fraser, and then I think we can say with some certainty now that the neoliberal experiment begins in full force, courtesy of a Labor government. Again, it was a convention back then, in the 80s, to assume that only nasty right-wing governments would embrace neoliberal policy. So you'd expect it of Thatcher, you'd expect it of Reagan, but not of a Labor government, surely. Well, I think that just tells us something about people's capacity to believe anything. And certainly you had a skilled salesman in the form of Hawke. You had let's say, simply a compliant Labor movement. And you had even people who belonged to the left, Trotskyists, people from the Communist Party, who decided that Hawke was offering them a brand new order in which they would have a secure place at the seats of power. And I never got over my shock at seeing people like Laurie Carmichael spruiking the Accord, which was the basis of the deal that would be done in the 80s. We will protect your social wage, said Laurie Carmichael, and in return, we'll return real wages back to the levels they were at in the 1960s. And we'll start the experiment with deindustrialising the country, and we'll experiment with deregulation of everything that walks, lives and breathes.
And Brian Howe too, with his deserted poor.
Don't talk to me about Brian Howe. Oh yeah. A quick digression, this is not something I want to talk about too much, but I remember trying to get Four Corners interested in the great betrayal that Howe engineered as the leader of the left. In return for a lot of money for his urban program, he was prepared to recommend privatisation. And he did that in 1980, and I said to the Four Corners producer, this is the biggest single story in public policy in this country's history. They said, what are you talking about? No idea. So, what we see, to turn to the nub of the thing, by 1986 it's apparent that the commitment to full employment has been killed off. It was declared in effect defunct by, I think it was John Howard, but it might have been his predecessor as Treasurer Philip Lynch in 1979. Do you remember? No. Anyway, it's certainly, there's a sense that there's a corpse in the room certainly, and it's now declared dead, probably in 79, but certainly by 83 it's a done deal. No government in Australia will ever again commit to an idea like full employment. That idea is off the agenda. By 87, the OECD has come up with an idea. It's called the active society model. It basically says there's a problem. We are now in an era of permanent long-term unemployment. We can't afford to acknowledge this too openly. This is a discussion that Howard attends at Brussels, in Paris, sorry, in late 86, and he brings back I've discovered a new truth to Melbourne in early 87. So we're not going to be able to return to full employment ever, because the market won't allow that anyway, so you just have to put up with naturally occurring levels of unemployment and inflation. You will need to, nonetheless, do something, and that is to not let the unemployed lose their morale. You'll need to keep their morale up by keeping them active. This idea is then fed through to the formal process of policy review, which the Hawke-Keating government initiated in 87, the so-called Cass Social Security Review, which would run for nearly 3 years under Professor Bettina Cass. Another left progressive who didn't quite deliver on whatever that meant back then. And this would lead to the first major review and overhaul of the Australian social security system since it was formed back in the mid-40s. The effective logic of this is simple, and again, someone was talking about the way things can be made magically to happen. Here we see the magical transformation of the problem of unemployment into the problem of the unemployed. The unemployed become the problem. It's their deficits that will become the focus of program after program. It's their lack of experience, it's their lack of stickativity, of resilience, financial capacity, blah, 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 blah. And,
passion.
well, whatever, everything, a lot. So the problem of unemployment, which if you accepted it as a problem, then you might expect governments to want to do something about it. That could never be allowed to happen. The market was the appropriate mediating device that would fix the problem of unemployment. If it can't fix it, then tough titty. And meanwhile, the problem of the unemployed has to be dealt with, because they could become a source of trouble, what we now, in the current language category, call a source of social incoherence or dissent, or a problem of social cohesion and salvation. So Bettina Cass has given her writing instructions to reform, redesign the social security system. And the result will be what has now become an alarmingly complex system of increasingly discrete systems of benefits, payments, all paid at different levels with all sorts of strange and complicated and arcane rules of access and all the rest of it. That is the accomplishment of the 80s. The Cass Review means that we start to see things like the introduction of Newstart and other forms of youth allowance. We see all the arcane elements which are, at this point, still be run through what was then the Department of Social Security and the old CES. And of course, the next stage, which is part of the story that we can attribute to Paul Keating's government, is the beginning of the idea that we need to privatise and outsource the state-run elements of employment services. And this, of course, is occurring at the same moment as the great assault begins on the industrial relations system in its entirety. And at that point, I'd say much of the destructive work of the neoliberal makeover is effectively accomplished during the time that Hawke and then Keating are Prime Ministers. What's left for the coalition government when Howard comes into office in 97 is really some tidying up. There's some pushes and pulls to try and get more work being done. Meanwhile, at the state level, of course, you've got massive privatisation, because much of the stuff that's going to get dropped off, re-engineered, is in the hands of the state government, so you start setting up state banks and utilities and energies companies and all the rest of it. So the effect of all this, I think, is to create a new kind of order in which the focus, the rhetoric, the vocabulary is couched in terms of the unemployed, their problems, their deficiencies, and what we need to do things to them to make it somehow stick together. I'm not going to go into the elaborate detail that you could go into in terms of tracing out the long and the tortured history of the changes that we've made. That's done in the paper. You can check all the details of that if you want. So the essence of this is to say that, in a sense, though the nature of the economy, the society, the fabric of our community is utterly different by the 1990s to what it was like in colonial Australia back in the 1870s, for example, even in Australia in the 1920s. There is a continuous logic, a thread, and it's this thread that somehow says, within the terms of what we call a moral economy, some people are not deserving. Some people don't have fundamental rights. Some people don't deserve the kind of support that you might think a civilised society would wish everyone to have. And you're going to create an increasingly punitive, discriminatory and stigmatising system. I think that's the effective logic that, in a sense, ravels out across several centuries. So, in a sense, not much changes over a 200-year period. It gets nastier in some ways. I think the kinds of surveillance, the intrusiveness, some of you will be well familiar with the way in which people's beds and linen would be inspected for signs of immoral conduct, etc., etc. So what we see, I think, is through the late 20th and now the 21st century is with all the new technological capacities that a modern surveillance state has, it can do much more in surveillance. It can make life much trickier, much harder for people who are caught up in the system. And the most recent versions of that, of course, we now start to see the obscenities of the sorts of things that go on because you've got an algorithm that can generate letters of demand, such that leads then to a kind of a process of endless harassment, suspension of payments, demands for repayment of monies that are imaginatively understood to be owed to the government, and so it goes on. So all of that can be dealt with, I think, if you want to detail in the paper. I'm much more interested in the question, finally, of what we should be doing. And I wanted to spend a bit of time on that because I think this is the more interesting question. As someone who spent 4 decades thinking and doing a lot of work around the policy traps, the question of what we do to fix things, I think, is the most interesting question. So let me make 3.5 suggestions. There's 3 ideas and a half, which I'll just get to right now. I'm assuming that I don't need to persuade you that the system we've got now is unnecessarily complicated, unnecessarily stigmatising. It's no longer legitimate. And I think that's the fundamental point I'd want to start with. It's not legitimate in a moral or social sense. It does not require us to believe in it. There's nothing in it that's admirable, politically or morally. It's offensive and it's a punitive system. And why we do this to people, I don't know. So, there are, I think, and I've made the case in the paper, that there are fundamental design flaws in what we've allowed to happen in the last 3 decades, in particular under successive governments. Now, if you'd asked me to do this a year ago, I probably would have banged on about the idea of a universal basic income. If you got me on a drunken night, I'd probably still want to argue a case for that. I've spent some decades arguing for it, and it's to my credit or my eternal shame that I persuaded the Greens Party, which I helped set up in '91, and I wrote the policy which said Green supporter guaranteed adequate income, and I documented that and I estimated the funding and all the rest of it. But I'm not going to do that now because Owen said, don't do that. So, let me say, I think now that it's not an either or. I think we can have a number of elements that come together. But let me make the case tonight for the following. First thing we should do straight away is increase Newstart and double it. That will cost about 11.1 billion to double. So at the moment it's about 11.1, is that right? Something like that. Let's double that. That would bring it up to a basic minimum wage, standard of about $33,000 a year. That's not a lot of money. It's still grossly inadequate in all sorts of ways. But that would be the first thing I'd do. And if I was a government with some guts and a little bit of vision and maybe a strong leader in charge with some moral compass, I'd be doing that. Let's pretend I was Bill Shorten on steroids. Hard to imagine. Now, the first thing that people in Australia usually say is, where's the money coming from? Right, the answer is very simple. How many of you have heard of taxation expenditures? This is a test of your, let's call it economic literacy, or your fiscal literacy if you want to be really precise. Does anyone know what a tax expenditure is?
Yes. Don't ask me to explain.
Alright, let's pretend you know. So, it's simple. Negative gearing is an example of the 289 schemes which make it possible for wealthy individuals and or companies to evade tax. It is estimated, because the federal government provides an estimate as they're required to do under their Charter of Budget Honesty, this year, 2017-18, to be worth about $164 billion. And that compares with the $171 billion that is being spent in the same period on welfare. It's not insubstantial. Welfare expenditure is the biggest single item of Commonwealth Government expenditure. Taxation expenditure is the second. I should add immediately, because the Tax Office, the ATO, is very clear about this, when it says we actually can't estimate the totality of taxation expenditure. It's roughly in the order, they say we can calculate it for about 2/3 of the schemes that are available.
Can you just quickly define taxation
Yes,
expenditures as anything that is spending of taxes? Or
No. To put it in its formal way, in its formal terms, it's an expenditure. It's a form of revenue which you've decided not to seek. So you're handing back. And in a sense, if you want to put it in dramatic terms, it's what taxpayers agree to do to help you with your 5 investment properties, which you've borrowed money for, deliberately with a view to losing money, so that you can claim a discount on your entire taxable income.
So tax not collected, basically.
Yes, it's tax not collected by agreement. Now, negative gearing, I should add, is precisely worth $11.2 billion. So you could, in a stroke, and if the current opposition decides to proceed, it could decide, I'm not going to believe it will, to knock off negative gearing. You could actually fund the increase in Newstart allowance just from that one cut. Negative gearing is a very small part of the total picture of tax expenditure. This is all documented, and I've laid it out, and I've provided you with the ATO estimates for each of the 115 schemes they can talk about, not the other 130 they can't because they don't know. Is this a public policy scandal? I would have thought so. It's got nothing much to do with the fact that, as you will remember, when the current ATO Commissioner announced that there were, of the 1,500 top companies in Australia, 534 paid 0 cents in the tax dollar. They paid no tax. And there was a bit of a hoot when one of the biggest Dunning paper companies paid $8 in tax that year on revenues of $1 billion. That's got nothing to do with it. That's another problem. That's about tax evasion that's legalised. So I'm going to suggest that's the half part of the suggestion. The big suggestion is we make a commitment to a doubling at this point of the Newstart allowance, and we fund that. The half part of the solution is we draw on a systematic program of clawing back tax expenditures so that they don't work. The biggest item, by the way, is capital gains. It's worth about $40 billion in the last year. You can imagine the screams of outrage should this ever become a public idea, political idea, but I think that would be a scream of outrage well worth hearing. The second idea is a simple one. As some of you will know, I was involved in a process a few weeks ago to launch a campaign for a Charter of Human Rights in Australia. Australia is the last liberal democracy on the planet that still yet has to formally acknowledge a legal commitment to people's human rights. So my second suggestion is that we do what we should have done. We're also in breach, not only are we in breach of the requirement that we agreed to when we signed off on the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to introduce that as domestic legislation. We've never done that, we're in breach of that one. But also the other covenant on economic, social and cultural rights. You should check it out. It was the big two, and in that is a very simple proposition. At Article 6.1, we agreed back in 1975, it was under the Whitlam government that signed off on this, to recognise the right to work, which includes the right of everyone to the opportunity to gain his living by work which he freely chooses or accepts, and will take appropriate steps to safeguard this right. That is, governments undertook to make employment a matter of right. Australia has been in consistent and persistent breach of this treaty since 1976. It's time to haul it in and require it to introduce this as domestic legislation, which is what we agreed to do in Article 3 of that particular covenant. The third thing which will give effect to this is what in America they're calling a Green New Deal. Again, I just had to say, when I broached this with the Greens that I was going to talk to a few weeks ago, do you know about the Green New Deal? And there was this kind of thunderous silence. And you go, what the hell are the Greens doing? Well, they're obviously preoccupied with other things than policy. The Green New Deal you'll possibly be familiar with. It was given a bit of airplay in February this year when the new Congresswoman, what's her name? Ocasio-Cortez, formalised a resolution before the House of Reps in the American Congress, and there was an equivalent resolution passed or adopted, or presented, sorry, in the Senate. It's an idea which they're calling a Green New Deal, which is obviously a nod in the direction of the Rooseveltian New Deal of the 30s. I would think we could call this in Australian Green Fair Go. Simple idea. It brings together the commitment to full employment and the response to the deepest existential threat Australia's faced since the Second World War. We are facing, as numerous reports are now pointing out, a catastrophe in the offing if we allow global warming to proceed to 3 to 4 degrees Celsius. This planet becomes unlivable. The core elements that make up the fair go, I think, would look something like this. The Australian government would commit to a combination of full employment and investment on a major scale in transitioning away to a point where we are achieving our Kyoto climate target, emission target. That is to say, we would achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions through a fair and just transition away from fossil fuels for all communities and workers. Now what this means was, I think, given an exemplary and clear outline on Monday night on Four Corners. It would mean, amongst other things, hold your hats. An agreement to phase out all petrol and diesel cars by 2030. That's kind of a gulp. You saw the result in the response of some of the blokes in northern Queensland where they told, well, maybe we'll be driving an electric car now rather than a petrol guzzler. The combination of investment in new forms of infrastructure would also go to the creation of high quality, high wage jobs to facilitate this transition. It's a remarkable fact, which was again given full airing on Monday night by Four Corners, that we actually already have the capacity from renewable energies to meet our energy needs. The only problem is the state-owned energy companies have allowed our grid to deteriorate. Does anyone know who owns Jemina in Victoria? It's the company that delivers and looks after the power lines in Melbourne, as I found out when a tree crashed through and brought down the power line. Do you know who owns it?
AGL.
Eh?
Is it AGL?
No, they're in company with AGL, but they're also suing the arse off each other at the moment for various reasons that I don't even begin to understand. $100 million suit. No, it's the state Chinese Communist Party owns Jemina. So don't ask about privatisation and market models and all the rest of this. Is bullshit. But the problem is that we've allowed our grid to deteriorate to the point where we can't actually deal with the possibility of the energy supplies coming from renewables, which are now available. But we can't do it because the grid is broken down. So that alone is looking like a $50 to $80 billion investment project just to get some of that sorted very quickly. Point, to finish simply, a fair go, a green fair go, based on a commitment, a formal commitment to full employment, I think has a great deal to recommend it. The detail can be worked through. I commend again, I found that the Greens seemed not to know of a bloke called Paul Hawken. No. Paul Hawken organised a huge effort involving several thousand scientists. The book is called Drawdown. It's a beautifully produced, scientifically audited account of the 100 approaches, ideas, programmatic things that we'd need to do to achieve the avoidance of catastrophe. It documents in extraordinary detail what we'd do, how we'd do it, what it would cost, what the benefits would look like across the major 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 major industry sectors in this country. It's an extraordinary accomplishment. Again, I find it appalling that the Greens know nothing about this.
When was it printed?
Oh, a year and a half ago. It's only a year and a half ago. What's a year and a half in time? So, what we've got is a circumstance in this country where the biggest single changes could be made in the electricity sector, which is responsible for 1/3 of our greenhouse gas emissions, and transport. Both of that would take care of half of our problem and fix it. There's no doubt in my mind that we do face a massive existential challenge. Let's say it's a life-threatening challenge. It ought to be the basis for a dramatic policy shift with appropriate leadership providing both the moral and the inspirational qualities that will enable us to deal with the problem we face. I just simply remind you at this point that if the challenge is as grave as I think it is, as grave as the one we faced back in 1941, we're also facing fundamental challenges which we've allowed now for some decades. We like to think that we're a society committed to the fair go. We want to believe that we're an egalitarian society where the fair go actually matters, but in much the same sort of way that idea came under attack and was subverted in the 1930s, we've seen an equivalent subversion of that idea for the last 3 or 4 decades. Much of it fed and sponsored by Labor governments. When I ask you the following question, and it's not a trivia question, which of the recent Prime Ministers now has the largest amount of wealth between Rudd and Turnbull? It is Rudd. His wealth is now estimated to be far greater than that of Lucy and Malcolm put together. That's an interesting finding. Rebecca...
Is it Rudd's wife?
No, this is Rudd's own fortune. He now, just for your benefit, Marcus, so you can go check this out, and I'm not making it up, he runs now a vodka company and a perfume company for young women. And that alone has generated earnings of 182 million last year. That's as according to the company accounts. Where did he get that money from? Well, we won't ask. We know where it comes from, his speaker's fees, which are quite extraordinary. Rebecca Huntley put out a quarterly essay a week ago. It's called, what's it called? In here somewhere. She's looking at the question, which is a really interesting framing. Australia Fair, listening to the nation. Her basic point is simple. She says that the idea that our politicians are led by opinion polls is complete bullshit. They're not. Public opinion for the last decade and a half has been consistently, and we're talking about big majority numbers, supporting things like substantial investment in affordable public housing, a ban on foreign donations to political parties, investment in renewable energy, increased funding even to the ABC, cheaper childcare, abolition of negative gearing, legalised euthanasia, a republic, and so the list goes on. All of the progressive ideas that we might say are, I think, common sense, have been embraced, adopted, argued for by at least 60 to 75% of Australians consistently over the last 2 decades.
And that's what was so remarkable, that they got the equal marriage thing.
Yeah. Well, that was also, again, something that
people...
And people didn't want it done the way it was done.
But in fact, they lead the debate.
Well,
you know, the debate is, and they create the kind of circumstances.
So, are these views heeded, as she says, rhetorically, by our political leaders? Often the claim is made, as she said, as I've said, that politics and politicians are poll-driven. That's bunkum, she says. There is no consistent evidence that the policy agenda of the major parties has been shaped mainly by opinion polls. Quite the opposite. And that's, I think, leading, as she will then insist, that the current crisis of democracy represents a deep and growing divorce or chasm between what the political culture says and what ordinary people want.
We can't afford them.
No. So, my closing point is simple. both of our major parties, and maybe even the Greens, remain wedded to an irrelevant, illegitimate and delusional neoliberal politics. If you want to know what that looks like in Victoria, look at the public housing policy, so-called, run by a Labor government and Martin Foley in particular. Beyond belief. It's a neoliberal policy and it's based on the delusion that governments can't do these things effectively, so you have to hand it over to private interests to do it for us. Now, Rebecca, to her great credit, maybe, is calling for a radical renewal of social democracy by our Labor Party. Whew, now that's a big call. Am I prepared to wait? I don't think so. I don't see the current Labor opposition led by Shorten et al. As rising to that challenge, but it begs the question, where then will such a renewal come from? Where is the contemporary existing political mechanisms, machinery, movements, groups that will do this for us? That's the problem we have at the moment. So it goes back to old debates and old arguments I had back in the 80s, people like Joe Camilleri, etc. And the result was that awful moment when we decided to embrace something called the Rainbow Party, the Rainbow Movement. That was a classic clunker. So it's a political question at some moment. Where do we go? Where will we find institutional resources, which we do need? You need organisation, you need resources, you need people, you need leadership, you need all the elements of an effective social movement. Where will that be? I don't know. But I do think that we can start a conversation tonight about where we might begin to do some of this stuff, because I think, if I'm right, we ain't got much time to get much of this sorted. And we do need to get it sorted quickly. So is it right if I finish there, Aaron?